Senior investigator Artem Gorin signed his name. A sweeping, confident signature honed over 23 years of service, and placed his pen on the table with a soft thud. The sheet of paper, the last in a thick grey folder, now bore the stamp of completion. Case number 312, concerning the sudden death of citizen Elena Pavlovna Kotova, 47 years old, was officially sent to the archives. Closed due to lack of evidence of a crime. An accident. Period. Captain Orlov, his young and unpleasantly energetic colleague sitting opposite him, nodded with satisfaction, as if Gorin had just passed his final exam. For Orlov, the world consisted of facts and statistics, and a closed case was a nice, neat checkmark in the report. Another point in the solvability column, albeit in such a prosaic way. Well, that's it, Artem Sergeyevich. You can breathe out now. Orlov's voice was cheerful, full of the enthusiasm that Gorin had long since lost. Everything fits together perfectly. The neighbors heard her fiddling with a stepladder around 8 in the evening. She was changing a light bulb in the hallway. The socket was old, still Soviet. She slipped, fell, and hit her temple on the corner of the nightstand. The pathologist confirmed it was a traumatic brain injury, incompatible with life. No signs of a struggle. No foreign fingerprints. The door locked from the inside, with 2 turns of the key. A classic domestic tragedy. Quick and clean. Gorin was silent, looking at the folder. Quick and clean. These words caused him a dull irritation. A person's death could not be clean. It always left behind a mess. Grief. Unspoken words. Orphaned belongings in an empty apartment. And sometimes, details that didn't fit into the smooth picture of the official report. He opened the folder again and pulled out a small plastic bag with evidence. Inside lay a perfectly smooth, almost round black stone the size of a quail's egg. A pebble, polished by water to a mirror shine. It had been found on the rug by the front door, a few meters from the body. It did not belong to this house. There were no aquariums or decorative stone compositions in Kotova's apartment. There was no street dirt on her shoes to suggest that she had brought it in from outside. The stone just lay there, alien and inexplicable. You're talking about that cobblestone again? Orlov sighed, noticing his boss's gaze. Artem Sergeyevich, what's so special about it? Maybe it was left in her coat pocket from her last vacation. Or maybe she carried it in her bag as a talisman. Single women can be strange. We can't build theories based on a stone. We have an expert opinion, testimony, facts. The system requires facts. The system. Gorin hated that word. For Orlov, the system was a deity, a set of rules, circulars, and regulations that made the world understandable and predictable. For Goha, however, the system was increasingly becoming a soulless mechanism that ground human destinies into dry statistics. He belonged to the old school of investigators, those who believed not only in facts, but also in intuition, in that quiet inner music that began to sound false when something was wrong with a case. And now that music was playing a funeral march for common sense in his head. He felt a splinter, a tiny fragment of wrongness that prevented him from accepting this simple, logical, and convenient version for everyone. But you can't sew intuition into a protocol, and you can't put a premonition in a folder as evidence. You're right, he said hollowly, putting the bag with the stone back. The system requires facts, and the facts say the case is closed. You can file it away. Orlov eagerly grabbed the folder, as if afraid that Gorin would change his mind. Youth does not tolerate doubt. It craves certainty. Artem Sergeyevich watched him go and remained alone in his office, which smelled of old papers and cheap coffee. He walked over to the window. The September evening was descending on the city, lighting up the windows opposite with squares of yellow light. Somewhere out there, people were returning from work, having dinner, watching television, living their ordinary lives, unaware that a few hours earlier, in one of the apartments in this city, another life had been cut short. And no one but him cared about the little black stone that disrupted the harmony of this tragic accident. He felt like a dinosaur, a dying breed for whom intuition and attention to detail were more important than speed and accountability. Professional duty demanded that he put an end to it. But something inside him screamed that it was only a comma. He returned home late, broken and devastated. The empty apartment greeted him with silence and the smell of cold dust. He didn't turn on the light, went to the kitchen, and poured himself a glass of water. In the reflection of the dark window, he saw a gray-haired, tired man, with deep wrinkles around his eyes. He hadn't noticed how old he had become. His work sucked all the life out of him, leaving only a shell filled with other people's tragedies. He lay down on the sofa, still dressed, and closed his eyes. The Kotova case wouldn't let him go. The image kept reappearing in his mind's eye. The lifeless body, the overturned stepladder, the dim light of the only surviving light bulb, and that blue-black, unnaturally smooth stone on the shaggy carpet. It was like a black hole in the fabric of reality, sucking in his peace of mind. With these thoughts, Gorin fell into a heavy, viscous sleep without dreams. And then, in the middle of the night, the dream came, bright, distinct, frighteningly real. He didn't see it, he was in it. He was standing in the hallway of that very apartment, on the third floor of an old 9-story panel building. The same dim light, the same smell of mothballs and wilting flowers. He felt the familiar pile of the carpet under his feet. Saw the corner of that very nightstand made of dark wood. Everything was exactly as it was in the crime scene investigation report. But the apartment was not empty. In the corner, by the coat rack with a lone raincoat hanging on it, stood a man. An old man in a worn coat that was too big for him and worn-out shoes. His face was covered with a network of deep wrinkles, and his gray hair fell in tangled strands onto his forehead. But that was not what struck Gorin. The old man was mute. He didn't make a sound, just looked at the investigator with his faded eyes, full of inexpressible anguish. There was no fear or reproach in his gaze, only a deep, universal sadness. He looked as if he had known Gorin all his life, as if they had both witnessed the same injustice. The old man slowly raised his hand and pointed not at the body, not at the ill-fated ladder, but somewhere toward the front door, where the black stone should have been lying. His lips moved silently, trying to say something, but not a single sound came out of his throat. And in that dead silence, Gorin suddenly realized with absolute clarity that this man had been there. He had seen everything. Gorin woke up from his own stifled scream. His heart was pounding in his chest. Cold sweat was streaming down his forehead. He sat up on the sofa, peering into the darkness of his room. The image of the silent old man stood before his eyes so clearly, as if he were still there in the corner of his bedroom. The dream did not fade away, did not melt into the morning twilight like most nightmares. It remained with him. imprinted on his mind with photographic precision. The case was closed, locked in a grey cardboard folder, and filed away. But that night, he dreamed of a witness, and Gorin realized that for him, it was only just beginning. The morning brought no relief. The dream did not dissolve in the grey light of the new day. On the contrary, it seemed to have absorbed itself into the very flesh of reality, poisoning it with its presence. Gorin came to work exhausted, with a heavy head and the feeling that he had not slept all night, but had been unloading train cars. The image of the mute old man haunted him like a persistent obsession. He saw his sad eyes reflected in his cup of cold coffee, in the glare on the glass of the bookcase, in the faces of passers-by outside the window. It was more than just a bad dream. It was like a memory of an event that never happened. He mechanically reviewed reports, signed some papers, and answered his colleagues' questions inappropriately. But all his thoughts were there, in the dark hallway of Elena Kotova's apartment. Captain Orlov noticed his boss's state and, as always, interpreted it in his own way, with the straightforwardness of a young, healthy body for which reflection was akin to illness. "You're overworked, Artem Sergeyevich," he said sympathetically, placing a cup of steaming tea in front of Gorin. "It's the Kotova case that's gotten to you. It's simple, but it's frayed your nerves. You need to rest. Take some time off. Go fishing. Clear your head." Gorin gave him a heavy look. How could he explain to this pragmatic, self-confident young man that it wasn't fatigue? How could he tell him about the dream without sounding crazy? "You know, Captain, I closed the case. But last night, I had a dream about a witness. A silent one. Let's reopen the case." Orlov would have tapped his finger on his temple, and he would have been right. Dreams don't count as evidence. You can't write intuition into a report. His entire 23-year career was built on logic, facts, and evidence. And now it was all crumbling under the weight of a single night vision. "Maybe you're right," Gorin replied vaguely, pushing his cup away. "My head really isn't working." He tried to focus on the new case, a trivial theft from a warehouse, but the letters in the report blurred, and the numbers didn't add up. The inner voice, the one that always helped him separate truth from lies, now repeated one thing. You missed something important. You closed your eyes to the truth. The feeling was so strong that he physically couldn't bring himself to do anything else. His professional duty was in fierce conflict with an inexplicable, irrational feeling that was pushing him back to the closed and archived case. He felt like a tightrope walker, balancing over the abyss between common sense and madness, and the rope beneath his feet was shaking treacherously. By lunchtime, he couldn't take it anymore. Grabbing his raincoat from the chair, he said briefly to Orlova, "I need to go to an address, check something." He wasn't lying. He really did need to check something. Check his own sanity. He got into an old company car and, without thinking twice, drove to the familiar address. He didn't know what he was going to do there. He had no plan, no goal. There was only an all-consuming, maniacal need to be there again, at the scene of the incident, to either convince himself of the absurdity of his dream, or find at least some confirmation of it. Driving up to the grey 9-story building, he parked a short distance away and sat in the car for several minutes, staring at the windows on the 3rd floor. An ordinary house, an ordinary courtyard, with a playground and rows of parked cars. Nothing mystical. He felt like an idiot, an old investigator who had gone to the scene of a closed case because of a nightmare. Finally, gathering his courage, He got out of the car. The cool autumn wind ruffled the hem of his raincoat. He slowly walked to the entrance, which he had entered a few days ago as part of the investigation team. At the entrance stood a shabby wooden bench where old women usually sat. But now, there was only one person sitting on it. An old man in a worn, baggy coat and worn-out shoes. Goran froze in his tracks. The blood drained from his face. It was him. The very same man from his dream. Every detail, the tangled gray hair, the deep wrinkles, even the way he sat, hunched over with his head dropped to his chest, matched with frightening accuracy. A cold chill ran down Goran's spine. The world swayed, losing its familiar, rational contours. Slowly, as if afraid of scaring the vision away, he moved closer. The old man raised his head and looked at him, and Goran met that gaze again. Faded eyes, full of inexpressible anguish. There was no surprise in them. It seemed as if the old man had been waiting for him. Goran swallowed the lump in his throat. "Good afternoon," he said hoarsely, not recognizing his own voice. "I'm an investigator. Do you live in this building?" The old man looked at him silently, then slowly shook his head. "Perhaps you knew Elena Kotova from apartment 27, Goran continued, feeling his palms sweat. Again the old man shook his head, but then he raised his hand, the same hand from the dream, and pointed first at the front door, then up at Kotova's apartment windows. Goran held his breath. "Did you see something?" he asked, almost in a whisper. The old man lowered his hand and pointed to his mouth, then shook his head again. He was mute. At that moment, reality finally split in two for Goran. One part, logical and familiar, screamed at him that this was a monstrous coincidence, a figment of his imagination, a consequence of stress. But the other, ancient and intuitive, whispered that he was on the threshold of something important, something that could not be explained by the laws of physics and criminology. The old man seemed to understand his confusion. He got up from the bench, looked around, and noticing a branch lying by the curb, picked it up. Then he walked over to a patch of bare ground under the tree, crouched down, and began to draw. His movements were slow but confident. First, he drew a simple rectangle, a door. Next to it appeared a schematic figure of a woman with long hair, Elena. Then, on the other side, he drew a second figure, tall, masculine, with broad shoulders. He pressed harder on the branch, making the outline of this figure bold and threatening. After that, he drew the male figure entering the door, and the female figure's eyes were replaced with wide, open circles, a symbol of fear. Then he drew a small circle that had fallen from the male figure's hand, a black stone. The drawing was primitive, almost childlike, but its meaning was clear without words. This was no accident. It was a visit that ended in tragedy. Goran stood, unable to move, and looked at these drawings on the ground. The witness, who could not speak, gave his testimony in the only way available to him. And this testimony completely destroyed the official version, which he himself had approved with his signature yesterday. He was faced with a choice that would determine not only his career, but also his future life. To believe in this miracle, in this mystical message, and go against the system, his colleagues, common sense, risking everything, or to turn away, leave, try to forget this day, this dream, this old man, and go on living with the knowledge that he may have betrayed the truth. The old man finished his drawing. He straightened up, leaning heavily on the tree trunk, and looked at Gorin one last time. His gaze no longer held that universal sadness. Something else appeared in it. Hope and a silent plea. Then he turned and slowly shuffled away, disappearing around the corner of the house. Gorin was left alone with these strange, silent signs on the damp autumn ground. The wind stirred the fallen leaves, and they seemed to whisper to him that there was no turning back. Gorin returned to the department, a different man. Outwardly, he was calm, even impenetrable. But inside, an icy storm raged. The drawings on the ground, traced by the hand of a mute old man, stood before his eyes, crowding out everything else. It was more than evidence, more than testimony. It was a sign sent to him from another irrational world that had suddenly invaded his orderly life. He sat down at his desk and sat motionless for several minutes, trying to make sense of what had happened. He, senior investigator Gorin, a man of facts and protocols, now clung to a single thread, a primitive drawing on the ground left by a silent ghost. He couldn't go to Orlov and say, "Reopen the case. I have evidence," drawn with a stick. That would be a direct path to the psychiatrist's office and early retirement. No, he had to act differently, quietly, unofficially, bypassing the system he knew so well. He waited until the end of the working day, citing a headache, and when the office was empty, he went to the archive. Under the pretext of checking the data, he requested case number 312 again. Receiving the grey folder, he secluded himself in a far corner, away from prying eyes. He did not start with the protocols and expert reports. He knew them by heart. He started with the inventory of Elena Kotova's personal belongings. Photographs, letters, notebooks, everything that had not been given much importance during the initial examination, as it was considered irrelevant to the accident. He leafed through old, yellowed photographs. Here was a young Elena, against the backdrop of the sea. Here she was with her friends at some demonstration. Here she was at her elderly parents' birthday party. The ordinary life of an ordinary woman. And suddenly, in one of the photographs taken 20 years ago, he saw her next to a young, tall, confident man. They were standing arm in arm in front of a building under construction. There was something familiar about this man. Something that vaguely echoed the bold, threatening outline in the silent witness's drawing. Gorin turned the photo over. On the back, in calligraphic handwriting, was written, "Vadim and Lena. Our first project. Our future. Vadim." The name caught his attention. He began leafing through Elena's old notebook, and he found it. Sokolov Vadim Igorovich. And next to it, a phone number that had long since fallen out of use. It was the first clue, the first material thread pulled from the mystical tangle. He returned the case to the archive and went up to his office. Using the office databases, he found everything he needed in a few minutes. Sokolov Vadim Igorovich, 49 years old. Head of the large architectural firm Sokolov and Partners. Successful, wealthy, married, 2 children. His face, now mature and marked by the stamp of success, looked at Goran from the monitor screen. Nothing in common with the world of a lonely woman from a 9-story panel building. Their paths seemed to have diverged decades ago. And yet, something made this man come to her on that fateful evening. The next day, Goran took a day off and went to meet with Vadim Sokolov. The architectural firm's office was located in a modern glass and concrete building in the city center. Everything here screamed wealth and success. Minimalist design, expensive furniture, impeccably dressed employees. Sokolov himself received him in a spacious office with a panoramic window. He was the complete opposite of the image Goran had formed. Tall, fit, in a perfectly tailored suit. He exuded confidence and strength. He looked at the investigator calmly, with a slight hint of condescending curiosity. Investigator Goran. Artem Sergeyevich introduced himself, showing his ID. Sorry to bother you, Vadim Igorovich. I am investigating the death of Elena Kotova. At the mention of Elena's name, Sokolov's face did not flinch. Only in his grey, cold eyes did something resembling annoyance flash for a moment. Yes, I heard. Very sad, he replied in an even voice. An accident, as I was told. How can I help you? We hadn't been in touch with Lena for many years. Are you sure? Goran looked the architect straight in the eye. We have information that you visited her shortly before her death. Sokolov smiled. It was the cold, calculated smile of a man accustomed to controlling the situation. Your information is incorrect, investigator. The last time I saw Elena was 15, if not 20 years ago. We went our separate ways a long time ago. I have my life. She had hers. We are people from different worlds. He spoke so convincingly, so logically, that for a second, Goran himself doubted his own righteousness. His whole world, a world of facts and evidence, rebelled against what he was doing. He, an investigator with vast experience, had come to a respected man with an accusation based on a nightmare and a drawing by a crazy old man. But the image of the silent witness came back to him, and his doubts receded. Does this stone mean anything to you? Goran took the plastic bag out of his pocket. Vadim glanced indifferently at the black pebble. No, it's just a rock. What does it have to do with me? It was found in her apartment, next to the body. Goran continued to press, even though he felt the conversation was going nowhere. He had hit a wall of confidence, money, and social status. Vadim Sokolov was a man who knew how to erase his past. He disowned Elena as if she was something shameful, a mistake of youth that could cast a shadow on his impeccable reputation. This caused Goran a dull irritation. He had seen people change, rise, and fall. But in the story of these two, a successful architect and a lonely, unhappy woman, there was some fundamental injustice, some break that he could not understand. What could connect them, and why did one of them rise so sharply, while the other remained on the sidelines of life? The conversation was over. Goran left empty-handed, feeling humiliated and broken. Vadim's resistance was so strong and confident that it shook his own resolve. Maybe Orlov was right. Maybe he was just overworked and now chasing ghosts. He drove through the city, not paying attention to the road, his thoughts racing from one extreme to another. But he couldn't give up. Not after looking into the eyes of the mute old man. In the evening, instead of resting, He returned to Elena Kotova's sealed apartment. He had a warrant for an additional search, which he had issued himself, exceeding his authority. He had to find something else, something tangible, something he could present not only to the system, but also to himself. Methodically, inch by inch, he searched the modest dwelling again. And his search was successful.
In a drawer of an old chest of drawers, under a pile of yellowed bedding, he found a secret compartment with a double bottom. Inside was a stack of old documents. Among them was a 20-year-old purchase agreement.
Half of an abandoned house in the suburbs, registered to Elena Kotova. The other half, according to the document, belonged to Vadim Sokolov. Gorin straightened up, holding the yellowed paper in his hands. His heart was beating fast. There it was. The ghost of the past had taken shape. They were connected by more than just a fleeting acquaintance. They were connected by shared property, a shared secret hidden within the walls of an old abandoned house. Vadim had lied, and now Gorin knew where he needed to go next. He left the apartment and locked the door. The night street greeted him with coolness and silence. He stood by the car, looking at the address written in the old contract, and he felt himself sinking deeper and deeper into someone else's secret, where each step led him not toward the light, but into even greater darkness. The drive to the suburbs took just over an hour, but for Gorin, that time stretched into eternity. He drove through a dreary autumn landscape, withered fields, bare groves, and sparse villages with smoking chimneys. The old service car hummed loudly, and this monotonous sound only increased the investigator's inner tension. He replayed the events of the last few days over and over in his head. The closed case, the inexplicable dream, the meeting with the mute old man, the cold reception at Sokolov's, and finally, the yellowed contract found in the hiding place. Each detail was a link in a chain, and that chain had led him here, to an abandoned house that held a 20-year-old secret. He felt like a prospector following the trail of a gold vein. But instead of excitement and anticipation of profit, his soul was filled with a cold, clinging fear. He understood that he was trespassing on dangerous territory, and the deeper he dug, the more he risked disturbing something that should have been buried long ago. The address listed in the contract led him to the outskirts of an old cottage village. The house stood in a remote location, at the end of a street overgrown with weeds. When Gorin saw it, he felt a chill run down his spine. This was the place. He didn't know where this certainty came from, but the contours of the two-story building with its dark window openings, the crooked porch, the old sprawling tree by the gate. All of it was painfully familiar to him. It came to him from the depths of his memory, from that disturbing dream that had started all this madness. The house from his night vision had taken shape, and it was both frightening and right. He was finally convinced that he was on the right track. He left his car at the beginning of the street so as not to attract attention and continued on foot. The silence was broken only by the rustling of dry leaves underfoot and the mournful creak of rusty hinges on the gate, which he pushed open cautiously. The yard was overgrown with waist-high weeds. The house looked dead. Peeling paint, boarded-up windows on the first floor, a collapsed roof on the porch. It seemed that no human had set foot here for many years. But that was not the case. Coming closer, Gorin noticed faint footprints in the dusty ground. Someone had been here,
and quite recently. His heart began to beat faster. He was not alone. Walking around the house, he found what he was looking for: a window at the back that was not boarded up, but simply covered from the inside with a piece of plywood. He easily pushed it aside and looked inside. It was a dark room, smelling of dampness and decay. He pulled himself up and climbed inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. It was even darker and colder inside than outside. Sunlight barely filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows, casting slanted, dusty stripes on the floor. Goran took out a flashlight, and its beam revealed the outlines of old furniture covered with white sheets, a thick layer of dust on the floor, and thick cobwebs in the corners. He slowly moved deeper into the house, and with each step, the feeling of déjà vu grew stronger. The layout of the rooms, the creaky staircase to the second floor, the old fireplace in the living room, everything matched his dream with frightening accuracy. But now, there was something else mixed in with that feeling, the sense of someone else's presence. He didn't see or hear anyone, but he felt like he was being watched. This house wasn't just abandoned. It was defiled by something evil. And that evil hadn't left its walls. It was lurking here, in the darkness, waiting. Goring forced himself to suppress his panic, reminding himself that he was an officer, not a character in a horror movie. He was here to find evidence, not chase ghosts. He began a methodical search, looking under furniture and tapping on walls, and his persistence was rewarded. In the living room by the fireplace, he noticed that one of the floorboards was slightly raised. He pried it up with his knife and found a small hiding place underneath. Inside, on a pile of decayed fabric, lay an antique wooden box bound with darkened metal. His pulse quickened. Here it was. The answer. The reason he had come here. He carefully removed the box. It was heavy, made of dark wood, with intricate carvings on the lid. The lock was broken. With his heart in his mouth, Goran lifted the lid. The box was empty. Completely empty. Only the velvet lining inside retained a faint imprint of something rectangular. Perhaps a stack of letters or a diary. The disappointment was almost physically painful. He was too late. Whoever had left the tracks near the house had beaten him to it. They had taken what was stored here, leaving Goran with only an empty shell of mystery. He slammed the lid shut in anger and placed the box on the mantelpiece. It was all for nothing. He was back, at square one. He was about to leave, annoyed and angry with himself, when suddenly the beam of his flashlight slid across the wall above the fireplace and froze. There, on the cracked plaster, something was written. Uneven, clumsy letters, written in something dark brown, horribly resembling dried blood. The inscription was short. "You're next." It was a direct, undisguised message. To him. The killer didn't just take the evidence. He knew Goran would come here. He was waiting for him. And he left him a warning. At that moment, Goran's whole world narrowed down to that short, ominous phrase. A chill ran through him to his very bones. This was no longer just an investigation of an old case. It had become personal. He had crossed an invisible line and turned from hunter to prey. The evil he was looking for had found a voice, and that voice promised him death. He no longer doubted the reality of what was happening. He was not facing a ghost from the past, but a living, cruel, and intelligent opponent who was playing with him like a cat with a mouse. And now that cat had made it clear that the game was entering its final stage. He slowly backed toward the exit, his eyes fixed on the inscription, as if afraid it would come to life. He got out of the house, and without looking back, almost ran to his car. He was leaving this cursed place empty-handed, but with a chilling realization. He was following the killer's trail, and that trail led straight to him. Returning to the city was like surfacing from dark, icy water. Goran drove on autopilot, oblivious to the road or the scenery rushing by. The inscription on the wall of the abandoned house was constantly before his eyes. "You're next." Those two words, written in someone else's blood, were imprinted on his brain, pulsing with a dull, monotonous threat. The fear he had felt there, in the dead silence of the desecrated house, was gradually replaced by cold, focused rage. This was no longer Kotova's business. It had become his business, his personal war with an invisible enemy who not only killed, but also enjoyed the game, setting traps and leaving taunting messages. The empty box and the ominous inscription were a slap in the face, a challenge. And Goran accepted that challenge. He felt the resentment at his own powerlessness and humiliation melt inside him into a firm, unyielding determination to see it through to the end, whatever the cost. He arrived in the city late in the evening, but did not go home. The thought of the empty apartment, of the silence that now seemed ominous to him, was unbearable. Instead, he headed for the very courtyard where it all began. He did not know why he was doing this. Perhaps he was subconsciously seeking an encounter with the only person who could give him answers, even without words. The courtyard was empty and quiet. The playground looked lonely in the light of a single street lamp. Goran sat down on the same bench where the mute old man had been sitting and took out his cigarettes. He smoked one after another, looking at the dark windows of Elena Kotova's apartment and trying to piece together the scattered pieces of the puzzle. Vadim Sokolov, the abandoned house, the empty box, the writing on the wall. It was all connected, but the logic eluded him, drowning in the mystical fog that shrouded the case. He felt cheated. He believed in the signs, followed his intuition, and ended up at a dead end with a direct threat to his own life as his only trophy. Anger and disappointment fought within him with desperate hope. It was at that moment that he appeared. It was as if he had materialized out of the nighttime gloom. The silent old man approached the bench and sat down silently beside him. He did not look at Goran. His gaze was fixed somewhere in the distance, in the darkness. They sat in silence for several minutes. Goran did not dare to break this strange, tense silence. He felt that the old man had come for a reason. He waited. Finally, the old man turned his wrinkled face toward him. There was no fear or surprise in his eyes, only deep, all-understanding sympathy. It was as if he knew where Goran had been and what he had seen there. The old man got up, picked up another branch from the ground, and walked over to the familiar patch of bare earth. But this time, he did not draw a diagram of the visit. He sketched the outline of a box, and then next to it, a tall male figure, the same one as the first time. He showed how the figure opened the box, took something out of it, and left. Then he crossed out the drawing with a thick cross, and looked at Goran as if asking, Did you see that?" Gorin nodded silently. But the old man didn't stop there. He erased the drawing with his foot and started a new one. This time he drew two male figures standing side by side. One tall, Sokolov, and the second, shorter, stockier, whom Gorin could not recognize. Between them, he drew a sign of exchange, two arrows pointing toward each other. From Sokolov's figure, the arrow led to a box, and from the second figure, to a wad of cash, which the old man depicted as several rectangles with the ruble sign. Then he circled it all in a large circle, implying that it was a deal, an agreement. It was a shocking revelation. Vadim wasn't just a friend. He was involved in some kind of deal related to the contents of that box. He didn't steal it. He bought it or exchanged it for something. The truth turned out to be more complicated and dirty than Gorin could have imagined. His initial version crumbled to dust. He felt a wave of righteous anger rising in his chest. He had been used. His trust, his intuition, his desire for justice, all of it had been part of someone else's cynical game. He was a pawn, being moved around the board by invisible players. He wanted to scream in rage, grab this Sokolov by his expensive tie, and shake the truth out of him. But he restrained himself. He understood that anger was a poor advisor. He needed to keep a cool head to win this game. He looked again at the old man, who seemed to be reading his thoughts. The old man erased this drawing too. He looked at Gorin with a long, piercing gaze, then drew the last symbol on the ground. A key, an antique one with an ornate head, and next to it, the outline of a building with a cross on the roof. A church. The witness was not just revealing the past to him. He was showing him the way to the future. He was giving him a new thread, a new hope. Gorin looked at the drawing of the key and the church, and a light dawned in his mind. The box was empty, but that didn't mean the contents were gone forever. Perhaps they had simply been hidden away, and the key to the new hiding place was somewhere in the church. He didn't know which one, but he was sure he could find it. This was the last message. The old man straightened up, threw away the branch, and, without saying goodbye, slowly walked away, disappearing into the darkness as suddenly as he had appeared. Gorin was left alone with the last silent sign. He no longer felt like a victim. His rage gave way to cold, calculated determination. He understood that the truth was not what lay on the surface. You had to fight for it, wrest it from the clutches of lies and deceit, and he was ready for that fight. He got up from the bench and walked to his car. Now he had a new goal: to find the key and to open the last door behind which the truth awaited him. No matter how cruel it might be. The drawing on the ground, the key and the church, became a new starting point for Gorin, the only beacon in the thick fog of this case. But this beacon was deceptively simple. There were at least 24 churches and temples in and around their city, from ancient ones, rooted in the ground, to modern ones, sparkling with fresh gilding. To go around them all in search of who knows what would be madness, a waste of time, which, as his intuition suggested, he had less and less of. The threat on the wall of the abandoned house was not empty bravado. Gorin understood that he needed to act, not blindly, but based on logic. The very logic he had almost traded for mystical revelations. He had to understand which church was important to Elena Kotova. The answer could only be found in her past, in her life. The next morning, instead of rushing off on a search, he returned to the archive. He immersed himself once again in studying her personal belongings. But this time, he was looking not for compromising information or evidence, but for traces of her spiritual life. He leafed through the books, and among the cheap detective stories and women's novels, he found what he was looking for: an old, well-worn prayer book. Dried flowers and several small paper icons were tucked between the pages. On one of them, depicting St. Nicholas, the wonder worker, there was a stamp on the back. Church of the icon of the Mother of God, joy of all who sorrow. It was the first clue. A small, little-known church on the outskirts of an old working-class neighborhood. Goran felt a slight thrill of excitement. He was once again an investigator following a trail, not a confused spectator in a theater of shadows. He decided not to go there right away. First, he needed to gather more information. He went back to Elena's courtyard and began questioning the neighbors, this time asking completely different questions. He was not interested in visitors, but in the habits and roots of the deceased. The talkative old woman from the first floor, who had said nothing useful last time, now turned out to be a real find. Lenochka became very religious in recent years, she said, smacking her toothless mouth. She was quiet, withdrawn, and always went to church on Sundays. She traveled far away, taking the old tram. She said the priest there was kind and sincere, and there weren't many people. She even pointed out the tram number. The route led to the very area where the Church of All Whose Sorrow is Joy was located. There was no doubt left. Goran had found what he was looking for. He went there immediately. The church was exactly as he had imagined it. Old with peeling walls and a dome darkened by time. It stood deep in an overgrown garden, far from the noisy streets, as if hiding from the hustle and bustle of the modern world. Peace and tranquility reigned here, contrasting sharply with the darkness that surrounded his investigation. Inside, it was dimly lit and quiet. It smelled of incense and wax. Several old women were praying in front of icons. Goran found the abbot, Father Mikhail, in a small room that served as both his office and sacristy. He was an elderly priest with tired but kind and insightful eyes. Goran introduced himself, showed his ID, and a photo of Elena. "Yes, I remember her," Father Michael said quietly, looking at the photo. "God's servant Elena. She has been coming to us for the last few years. A very sorrowful soul." "Were you her confessor? Did she confess to you?" Goran asked directly. The priest shook his head. "The secrecy of confession is inviolable, my son. I cannot speak about what was said here, before the cross and the gospel. I can only say that a heavy burden weighed on her soul, a sin that poisoned her whole life. She was not seeking forgiveness, but atonement, and that is a much more difficult path." The priest's words echoed in Goran's soul. Atonement. Wasn't that what he himself was seeking? Going against the system and risking everything for the sake of an illusory truth. "I need to find something she might have left here." Goran decided to go for broke. "It's very important. It's not just evidence, it's a message. I'm looking for a key." Father Michael looked at him for a long time with his all-knowing gaze. It seemed as if he could see right through the investigator, see his doubts, his obsession, his desperate struggle. "She said that someday they would come for it," he finally said, shocking Goran. "She said she left it for safekeeping,
until the hour when the truth must be revealed. She didn't say who would come. She only said that this person would have a heart as searching as hers. The priest stood up and led Gorin to an old massive donation box at the entrance. He took a small key from his cassock pocket, unlocked the box, and lifted the heavy lid. Inside, among crumpled bills and a handful of coins, it lay. An antique key, darkened by time, with an ornate head. The very one that the silent witness had drawn on the ground. Gorin carefully took it in his hand. The metal was cold and heavy. It was not just a key. It was hope made real. "Where is the hiding place?" Gorin asked, not taking his eyes off his find. "In the bank. Safe deposit box number 217. She also left a rental agreement. Father Mikhail handed him a yellowed sheet of paper folded in 4. She said that her confession was kept there, not the one for God, but the one for people. Gorin didn't remember how he thanked the priest or how he left the church. He sat in his car, holding the key and the contract in his hands. Everything fell into place. Mystical signs and real facts merged into a single whole. He was driving to the bank, his heart pounding in his chest with frenzied force. He felt like an archaeologist standing on the threshold of an untouched tomb. The administrative formalities took some time, but his ID and the order he had prudently written out gave him access to the vault. A bank employee escorted him into a sterile, quiet room and left him alone in front of a wall of metal lockers. 217. He inserted the key, turned it, and the door clicked open. Inside was a single item, a thick notebook with a hard leather cover, a diary. He took it and returned to the car. He sat with the diary on his lap. Its cover was smooth and cold to the touch. He hesitated to open it. He understood that the truth awaited him on these pages, the very truth he had been desperately seeking. But he also understood that this truth could be monstrous. It could destroy everything. His ideas about victims and criminals, his belief in justice, his own mental balance. He looked at the diary, and it seemed to him that he was holding not just a notebook, but Pandora's box. He took a deep breath, preparing to look into the abyss of someone else's soul. He did not yet know that after reading the first page, he would never be the same again. Elena Kotova's story was just beginning, and the price of her redemption was written not in tears, but in blood. Goring sat in his car under the dim light of a street lamp. Night had enveloped the city, but for him, time had stopped. He opened the diary. Elena Kotova's neat, almost calligraphic handwriting covered the yellowed pages in even lines. This handwriting, so calm and neat, was in stark contrast to the horror that poured out of these lines. It was not just a confession. It was a cry from the soul that stretched over 2 decades. A cry about crime, fear, and a desperate but futile attempt at redemption. Gorin read, and the familiar world around him collapsed, burying all his previous versions, guesses, and conclusions under its rubble. He thought he was investigating an accident, or, at worst, a single murder. But the truth that unfolded before him in the pages of this diary was far more terrifying. It was rooted in the distant past, at a time when both Elena and Vadim were completely different people. Young, daring, confident that they could get away with anything. The diary began with memories of youth, carefree student life, and all-consuming love for Vadim. Eleanor described him as a bright, talented, ambitious young man who seemed to her to be the center of the universe. They were inseparable and made grand plans for the future. And one of the symbols of their love was that very abandoned house. It once belonged to Vadim's distant relatives and served as their secret hideaway, a place where they dreamed and loved, far from prying eyes. But one day, this place became the scene of a tragedy. Elena described that fateful evening with frightening candor, not missing a single detail. Jealousy, a drunken quarrel, a chance visitor, a young man who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. She did not write who delivered the fatal blow. She wrote, "We. We took his life. We buried his body under our fireplace, in the very place where we swore eternal love to each other. We buried not only him, but also our souls." Goring turned the page. His hands were shaking. He felt a chill run through him to his bones. Murder. An old, unsolved murder. That was what lay at the heart of it all. That was what had poisoned Elena's life all these years. She wrote about how she and Vadim tried to move on, how they built their careers and created the appearance of a normal life. But the past would not let go. It came to her in nightmares, stared at her from the eyes of everyone she met. Vadim, according to her, coped better. His pragmatic mind managed to build a wall between that day and today. He forbade her to talk about it, convincing her that it was the only way to survive. But Elena couldn't forget. Her guilt grew, year after year, turning into a cancerous tumor that consumed her from within. That was what brought her to church. She wasn't seeking forgiveness from God, but the strength to confess to people. And here, in the pages of the diary, Vadim Sokolov's role appeared in a completely different light. Gorin realized how wrong he had been, how blindly he had followed the wrong trail. Vadim was not a villain. He was as much a hostage to the past as Lena was. He did not threaten her. He did not try to kill her. On the contrary, he tried to save her. When Eleanor told him that she could no longer remain silent and wanted to confess everything, he was frightened. He begged her to reconsider, offered her money to leave and start a new life somewhere far away. The deal that the mute old man had drawn up was not a payment for silence, but a desperate attempt by one unhappy person to save another. He bought their shared secret from her. The very box where, as Gorin understood, Eleanor kept some evidence of their guilt. He took it to destroy it, to bury the past forever. But he was too late. Someone else already knew their secret. A third person who had remained in the shadows all this time. And that someone did not want the truth to come out. Gorin slammed the diary shut. His head was spinning. His neat picture of the world, where there was a victim and a murderer, had shattered into a myriad of pieces. Elena Kotova was not just an unfortunate victim. She was a murderer who had carried the cross of repentance her whole life. And Vadim Sokolov was not a cold, calculating scoundrel. He was a weak man who tried to escape his sin and protect the one he once loved. Everything was turned upside down. And at the center of this tragedy stood that very abandoned house. A place of love, a place of crime, a place of secrets, and, as Gorin now understood, the site of another murder. Elena's death was no accident. She had been killed. She had been killed so that she would not have time to tell her story, and whoever did it left him a message on the wall. He knew that Gorin would sooner or later get to the bottom of the truth. He was playing with him,
enjoying his powerlessness. Suddenly, a terrible thought struck Gorin. If the killer knew everything, then he also knew about the diary. He knew that Gorin now had it, and that meant that Gorin himself would be the next target. The threat on the wall was no longer abstract. It had become real and inevitable. But there was no fear. There was only a dull, aching pain in his chest. Pain for all the participants in this drama. And guilt. His own personal guilt. After all, if 20 years ago the system had worked as it should have, if someone had noticed the disappearance of that guy, if the case had been solved while the trail was still hot, then this whole tragedy could have been avoided. Elena and Vadim would have been punished, but perhaps they would have found peace. But the system had failed, and now it was up to him, Gorin, to correct that mistake. He felt responsible for everything that had happened. It was his duty. Not to his superiors, not to the law, but to those whose lives had been ruined by this old crime. He started the car. He knew what he had to do. He had to go back to that house. Immediately. He had to find what was left of the first victim. It was the only physical evidence that could confirm Elena's story and lead to her killer. He knew he was walking into a trap. He knew the killer was probably already waiting for him there. But he drove on anyway. He drove toward his fate, toward the evil that he himself, in his ignorance, had disturbed. The road was dark and deserted. The headlights picked out only the bare branches of trees, like bony hands, from the darkness. When he drove up to the abandoned house, it looked even more sinister than during the day. A black silhouette against the leaden night sky. He got out of the car, took a shovel and a flashlight out of the trunk. He walked towards the house, each step echoing in the deafening silence. He went inside. The same smell of decay and dampness, the same oppressive atmosphere. But now he knew what lay at its core. He walked over to the fireplace. In the light of the lantern, the words, "You're next," seemed even brighter, even more threatening. He put the lantern on the floor and set to work. He inserted the tip of the shovel into the gap between the hearth slabs and pressed down. The stone gave way. He threw it aside and began to dig. The earth was dense and compacted. He worked silently, fiercely, putting all his rage, all his pain, all his desperate desire to get to the truth into every blow. And soon his shovel hit something hard. He knelt down and raked the earth with his hands, and he saw them. Human bones, darkened by time. The night in the abandoned house froze, thickening around the light of the lantern, which illuminated the terrible discovery from the darkness. Gorin looked at the bones, darkened by time, and the world around him lost its sound. The echo of his own shovel blows, the roar of blood in his ears, the rustle of the night wind. Everything fell silent. All that remained was the silent, deafening truth lying before him in the dug-up earth. It was the end of one story and the beginning of another, far more terrifying. He was not the first to discover it. He was just the one who was 20 years too late. Coming out of his stupor, he got to his feet. His hands, stained with dirt, trembled not from the cold, but from tremendous internal tension. He took out his phone and dialed the number of the duty station. His voice sounded calm and detached, as if he were reporting some mundane accident. "Gorin here. A body has been found. Presumably a crime many years old. Send a team. He gave the address and hung up. He didn't bother to explain anything, knowing that an avalanche of questions, reproaches, and suspicions would soon befall him.
The arrival of the investigative team broke the dead silence in the house.
The bustling forensic experts in white gloves, the flashes of cameras, the businesslike conversations. It all seemed surreal to Gorin, out of place in this place steeped in grief and old sin. Orlov also arrived.
His face expressed a mixture of shock, disbelief, and poorly concealed admiration. He looked at the dug-up grave, then at Gorin, and could not understand how this stubborn old man, whom everyone had already written off, had managed to single-handedly unearth a crime from 20 years ago. Artem Sergeyevich, how did you... he began, but Gorin interrupted him. Later, Orlov. Everything later. He didn't want to explain anything, not because he wanted to keep it a secret, but because he himself didn't fully understand what force had driven him. How could he explain to his superiors that a silent ghost from a dream had led him to the crime scene? The news of the discovery had the effect of a bombshell. The case that Gorin had been pursuing unofficially, risking his career, was now the main event in the department. Old files on missing persons were brought up from the archives. The name was found quickly. A student at the local university who had gone missing 20 years ago. The case had never been solved and had been written off as unsolvable. Now it had a sequel. General Morozov, the head of the department, summoned Gorin to his office. He looked at him long and hard with his faded eyes, which showed both anger at his high-handedness and involuntary respect for the result. "Do you even understand what you've done, Gorin?" he growled. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest. Now this case is being monitored at the highest levels. There can be no mistakes. We need results. Fast and convincing ones." Gorin remained silent. He understood perfectly well what these words meant. The system needed someone to blame. And that someone had already been chosen. Vadim Sokolov was arrested the very next day. He was led out of his glass-walled office in front of his astonished colleagues. A successful architect with an impeccable reputation, he had suddenly become the prime suspect in 2 murders. During interrogations, he behaved exactly as a guilty person should. He contradicted himself in his testimony, denied everything, and was nervous. He hired the best lawyers, who stood between him and the investigation. He shouted that he hadn't killed anyone, that he was only trying to help Elena, to save her from herself. But against the backdrop of the remains found and her diary, these words sounded like pathetic babbling. For everyone, the bosses, the press, Orlov, the picture was clear. 20 years ago, they killed a guy together, and now that Helena had decided to confess everything, Sokolov had gotten rid of her to save his reputation. Simple, logical, convincing. But Gorin did not believe in this simplicity. Something in this perfectly constructed version bothered him. He reread Elena's diary over and over again. She wrote about Vadim as a weak, frightened man, but not as a cold-blooded killer. His actions, trying to buy his way out, taking the box, were the actions of a man trying to escape his past, not cover his tracks. And most importantly, there was the writing on the wall. "You're next." It wasn't Sokolov's handwriting. It was the handwriting of a player. Cold, cruel, confident in his impunity. The one who killed Elena and was now playing with him. Gorin. He felt that Sokolov was just another victim in the story. A scapegoat that the system would gladly sacrifice for the sake of a nice report.
He found himself completely isolated. No one shared his doubts. Orlov, who at first looked at him with admiration, now considered him a weirdo. "Sergeich, what are you looking for?" he said to him. "It's obvious. The motive, the evidence, everything points to Sokolov. Close the case. Get your stars on your epaulettes. Why are you making things so difficult for yourself?" Goran looked at his young colleague and saw in him a reflection of the entire system. Pragmatic, cynical, uninterested in the truth, but only in a convenient version of it. He felt like a dinosaur, a relic of a bygone era, when an investigator's intuition was valued no less than fingerprints. The pressure grew with each passing day. He was removed from the interrogation of Sokolov and hinted that it was time to prepare the indictment. He understood that time was running out. The real killer was at large and was undoubtedly watching his every move, enjoying how the investigation was going down the wrong path. On one of those difficult evenings, when despair had almost overcome him, he went back to that same courtyard, without knowing why. He sat down on a bench. He wasn't expecting a miracle. He just wanted to be in the quiet, in the place where it all began, and try to understand where he had gone wrong. And the old man appeared again. He came over and sat down next to him. In his eyes, Goran saw not sympathy, but something else. A silent reproach, as if he were disappointed in his student. The old man stood up and gestured for Goran to follow him. Goran followed him without hesitation. He expected the old man to lead him to a new place, to a new clue. But the old man led him through familiar streets. And after a while, Goran realized with amazement that they were going to his office. They stopped on the opposite side of the street. The massive grey building, with a coat of arms above the entrance, looked alien and hostile. The old man pointed at it with his finger. Then he folded his hands, as if holding a folder, and pretended to read it carefully. Then he pointed at the building again. He repeated this gesture several times, insistently, demandingly, and Goran understood. He understood so clearly and distinctly that a chill ran down his spine. The answer was not in the new evidence, not in the abandoned houses or the old graves. The answer was there from the very beginning, in the very fact of Elena Kotova's death, which he himself had closed. He had missed something, some trifle, a detail that no one had paid attention to, considering it insignificant. The silent signs were leading him, not forward, but backward, to the beginning, to the point where he had made a mistake. The old man looked at him, and for the first time Goran saw something like approval in his eyes. He nodded, as if to say, "Finally, you understand." Then he turned and slowly walked away, disappearing into the evening twilight. Goran remained alone, staring at the gray administration building. Now it was not just his workplace. It was a repository of secrets. He had to return there, but not as a victor, but as a supplicant. He had to reopen the case that he himself had buried. He had to go against everyone, against his superiors, against his colleagues, against logic. He had to find that very first thread that needed to be pulled to untangle this whole bloody mess. And he knew that the killer was watching him, waiting to see what his next move would be. Returning to the department was like entering a cage with tigers, voluntarily sticking his head into the predator's mouth. Goran was viewed with suspicion. His success in digging up a 20-year-old crime had already been replaced by the irritation of his superiors. The case was high-profile and resonant, but instead of striking while the iron was hot and pressing the obvious suspect, he began his dancing with a tambourine again. His request to retrieve the case file on the death of Elena Kotova from the archives, a case that he himself had closed a couple of weeks ago, with a verdict of accidental death, was taken as outright mockery. General Morozov, red-faced, thundered and lightning in his office. He yelled that Gorin was discrediting the entire department, that he was undermining the foundations of the investigation, that if he did not immediately present an indictment against Sokolov, he would be fired so quickly that he would not even have time to hand in his ID card. Gorin stood and listened silently. He was used to the general's anger, but now he sensed something more behind it. Fear. The system's fear that its flawless mechanism had failed. Orlov looked at him with obvious pity. "Artem Sergeyevich, why are you doing this?" he said in the smoking room, lowering his voice. "You signed everything yourself. The expert report, the testimony, everything is clear. Well, the guy slipped up, it happens. Why set yourself up? You're a hero. You uncovered the deaf man. Enjoy the moment." Gorin stared at the smoke from his cigarette and saw in its clouds the face of a mute old man pointing to a gray building. "There's a mistake, Orlov," he replied quietly. "I made it, so I'll fix it." Orlov just sighed heavily and walked away. He didn't understand. No one understood. Gorin was alone against everyone, but it was this loneliness that gave him strength. He knew he was on the right path. After several days of humiliating requests and direct confrontations, using his old connections and pulling the right strings, he finally got what he wanted. A worn cardboard folder with case number 247 landed on his desk. He opened it, and the smell of official paper and frozen tragedy wafted toward him. He immersed himself in reading. He studied every document, every photograph, every line of the protocol, as if he was seeing them for the first time. He relived that day when he stood in Elena Kotova's apartment and tried to piece together the picture of her last moments. He stared at the photographs. Here was her body on the floor. Here were her scattered belongings. Here was the window from which she had fallen. Everything was painfully familiar, and everything was correct. Too correct. As if someone had arranged all the details on the scene so that they would unmistakably point to an accident. He put the photographs aside and picked up the expert reports. He read them slowly, thoughtfully, delving into every word, every number. And there, at the very end of the forensic report, he found what he was looking for. One line that he had not paid attention to at the time, considering it insignificant. Microparticles of fabric not belonging to the victim's clothing were found under her fingernails. Composition, coarse wool, presumably dark-colored coat fabric. At the time, he decided that she might have caught on something when she fell. But now, this detail took on new meaning. Elena had fought back. She had clung to her killer, but that wasn't all. The main discovery awaited him in the most unexpected place. He was going through the papers and came across the report of the local police officer, who was the first to arrive at the scene. Among other things, the report mentioned that same black, perfectly smooth stone. But next to this mention was a note written in a different handwriting, in pencil. Not relevant to the case. P.S. Zavyalov. Zavyalov. The surname seemed vaguely familiar to him. He strained his memory and felt a chill. Pyotr Semyonovich Zavyalov. It was the very same investigator who had handled the case of the missing student 20 years ago. The one who had closed it with the wording, "No evidence of a crime." And now his surname was popping up here, in the case of Kotova's death, in the form of a pencil note in the margins. A coincidence? Gorin didn't believe in coincidences. The knot began to unravel. Two threads, separated by 20 years, converged at a single point. The name of that point was Zavialov. Finding him was not difficult. The old investigator had long since retired and lived in a quiet residential area on the outskirts of the city. Goring went to see him that same evening. He found the right house, went up to the third floor and rang the doorbell, which was covered with worn leatherette. The door was opened by a gray-haired, thin old man with tired but still sharp eyes. It was him, Pyotr Semyonovich Zavialov. "How can I help you?" he asked, eyeing the stranger suspiciously. Gorin introduced himself. At the mention of his position and surname, the old man's face did not flinch, but a shadow flashed in the depths of his eyes. A shadow of recognition. "I'm here about a case you worked on 20 years ago," Gorin said, looking him straight in the eye. "And about the case of Elena Kotova." Zavialov froze for a moment, then slowly stepped back, letting Gorin into the apartment. They sat in the small kitchen, cluttered with books. Gorin remained silent, giving the old man a chance to speak first. "I knew you would come someday," Zavialov finally said, looking out the window. His voice was quiet, creaky, like an old, unlubricated door. "I've been waiting all these years. I thought you would come sooner." And he told him everything, without hiding anything, without trying to justify himself. 20 years ago, when he was investigating the disappearance of that student, he had almost immediately come across Elena and Vadim. The evidence was circumstantial, but it was enough. He questioned them, and he saw not hardened criminals, but two terrified children who had made a terrible mistake. He saw their remorse, their horror, and he made a decision that ruined his entire future life and career. He hid the evidence. He buried the case. "Why?" Gorin asked. He couldn't understand how an investigator sworn to uphold the law could do such a thing. They were so young. Zavialov turned to him, and Gorin saw tears in his eyes. They had their whole lives ahead of them. I thought that prison wouldn't reform them. It would only destroy them. I decided to give them a chance at redemption. I thought that the burden of guilt they would carry for the rest of their lives would be the worst punishment for them. He said that he had been secretly watching them all these years. He saw how Vadim built his successful life, trying to use money and success as a wall to separate himself from his past. And he saw how Elena slowly faded away under the weight of her sin. He knew about her trips to church, about her attempts to find peace. And when she was killed, I realized it was my fault. Whispered the old man. My mercy turned into even greater evil. I arrived there after she had already been taken away. I found that stone. I knew it was a sign. I realized that someone else knew their secret, and that someone was the real killer. I left that note in the file, in the hope that the right person would see it. Someone who, unlike me, would not be afraid to see the case through to the end. Gorin listened to this confession, and he felt neither anger nor the desire to condemn this man. He saw before him not a criminal, but a tragic figure. A man who had taken on the role of judge and had failed to cope with the burden. His act, dictated by compassion, set off a chain reaction that led to another death 20 years later. Justice turned out to be a much more complex and cruel mechanism than the old investigator had thought. Who else knew? Gorin asked. That was the main question. Zavyalov shook his head. I don't know. That's the horror of it. I was sure we were the only keepers of this secret. But I was wrong. And Elena paid for my mistake. Gorin got up to leave. He had gotten what he came for. He had found the source, that very first wrong turn. But this revelation did not bring him relief. On the contrary, it made everything even more confusing. Elena Kotova's killer was not just someone who knew her secret. He was someone who knew that this secret had been buried by the investigator himself. He was part of that old story. Gorin left the building and looked up at the night sky. He stood on the threshold of the last, most terrifying truth, and he felt that the killer was somewhere nearby, watching him and waiting. Gorin drove through the night city, but saw neither the lights of shop windows nor hurried passers-by. Before his inner eye stood the face of the old investigator Zavyalov, distorted by pain and belated remorse. The old man's confession did not dot the I's and cross the T's, but only replaced some questions with others, even more frightening ones. Elena Kotova's killer didn't just know a 20-year-old secret. He knew that the justice system itself had buried that secret. He was invisible, a shadow from the past who possessed knowledge available only to a select few. He wasn't just an avenger, he was a player who pulled the strings from within the system itself. The thought was so monstrous that Gorin initially dismissed it. But it kept coming back, haunting and chilling him to the bone. He began to go over in his mind everyone who had access to the case, who was nearby, who was involved in the investigation in one way or another. And the more he thought about it, the clearer one person became. The one who was closest to him, the one who had pushed him toward the correct version from the very beginning. The one who looked at him with pity when he decided to go against the grain. Orlov. This guess was like a punch in the gut. Gorin didn't want to believe it. Young, pragmatic, a little cynical, but overall a good guy, his student. But the details, which had previously seemed insignificant, now came together to form a single, ugly picture. The insistence with which Orlov convinced him of Sokolov's guilt. His slight irritation when Gorin found new facts that did not fit the investigation's version. His perfect knowledge of the case materials. And that very phrase thrown out in the smoking room. You're a hero. You cracked the deaf man case. Enjoy the moment. He wasn't just suggesting that he calm down. He was suggesting that he stop. He was afraid that Gorin would dig too deep and get to him. A cold sweat broke out on Gorin. He realized that all this time the killer had been nearby, breathing the same air as him, patting him on the shoulder and calling him his mentor. He turned the car around and drove to the office. He had to see his eyes. Orlov was in his office despite the late hour. He was sorting through the papers on the Sokolov case, preparing them for transfer to the prosecutor's office. He was surprised to see Gorin. Artem Sergeyevich, why are you here so late? Has something happened? Gorin silently locked the door behind him. Orlov tensed. I spoke with Zavyalov, Gorin said quietly, without taking his eyes off him. Orlov's gaze faltered for a moment, but he immediately pulled himself together. With whom?
Which Zavyalov? Sergeyich, you've completely worn yourself out. Go home and get some rest. Tomorrow we'll finish everything, turn Sokolov in, and that will be the end of it. He told me everything, Orlov, about how he closed the case 20 years ago, about how he took pity on two frightened children. He thought he was giving them a chance at redemption, but he was wrong. Orlov rose from the table. His face became hard, impenetrable. I don't understand what you're talking about. This is the ravings of some senile old man. We have Sokolov. We have his motive. He had no motive to kill Elena. Gorin interrupted him. He tried to save her, to buy her silence. But you had a motive. That student they killed. Who was he to you, Orlov? The captain froze. The mask of pragmatic cynicism slipped from his face, revealing a grimace of pure, unadulterated hatred. He was my older brother, he hissed. The only family I had. They took him away from me. And your Zavyalov took away my justice. I spent my whole life looking for them. I joined the police to get access to the archives. I found him. I found Elena. I waited. I waited for her to be ready to confess everything. But why did you kill her? Goring couldn't understand. She wanted to confess herself. Confess? Orlov laughed coldly, maliciously. She would have gotten 5 years for manslaughter committed in the heat of passion. And Sokolov, with his money and lawyers, would have gotten off scot-free. Is that what you call justice? No. My justice is when he rots in prison for 2 murders. When he sits in prison for killing my brother and for killing his accomplice. That's justice. Now Gorian understood everything, the full depth of his monstrous plan. He wasn't looking for the truth. He was thirsting for revenge. Perfect, symmetrical, cruel revenge. He himself had become the evil he was supposedly fighting. And the wool under her fingernails? Gorin whispered. It's from your coat. Orlov smiled crookedly. Details. You always loved to dig into details. Mentor, you taught me that. The next day, Gorin sat in General Morozov's office. He laid everything out. The conversation with Zavyalov, Orlov's confession. He expected any reaction, shock, anger, disbelief, but the general was calm. He was silent for a long time, tapping his fingers on the table, and then said, looking somewhere off to the side, "That can't be." "But it's true," insisted Gorin. "Orlov is a murderer." "I said it can't be." Morozov cut him off, his voice sounding metallic. "Do you understand what that means? An investigator kills a man to frame another in a case that another investigator illegally closed 20 years ago. Do you want the whole country to know what's going on here? The Sokolov case is flawless. The evidence, the motive, public opinion. It will be closed. Orlov will be transferred to another city with a promotion. And you, Gorin, you're a hero. You solved a 20-year-old murder. You'll get an award, honor, and a well-deserved retirement. Everyone will be happy. Gorin looked at the general and didn't recognize him. Sitting in front of him was not an officer, but a cold, calculating functionary for whom the reputation of the system was more important than human lives and the truth itself. At that moment, Gorin realized he had lost. He could find the killer,
But he couldn't defeat the system. He couldn't change this world built on lies, compromises, and convenient versions of the truth. He stood up. "I can't," he said quietly, but firmly. "It's an order," growled the general.
"I'm leaving," replied Goran, put his ID on the table, and walked out of the office without looking back. He walked through the corridors of the administration, which suddenly seemed foreign to him. He passed offices where work was in full swing, where people were writing reports, arguing, and proving their points. But he saw all this as meaningless fuss, a game of justice where the rules were set by people like Morozov. He went down the stairs and walked out through the massive doors onto the street. Bright sunlight hit his eyes. He stood on the porch, not knowing where to go or what to do next. His whole life was here, within these walls. And now it was gone. He felt emptiness, bitterness, but at the same time, a strange, unfamiliar feeling of lightness. It was as if a heavy burden had been lifted from his shoulders. He had lost the battle, but he had kept the only thing he had left: his conscience. And at that moment, on the other side of the street, he saw a familiar figure. A silent old man in a worn coat stood and looked straight at him. He did not draw signs or point the way. He just looked, and in his deep, sad eyes, Goran saw for the first time not reproach, but something like a warm, quiet smile. The old man nodded slowly to him, once with dignity and understanding. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the colorful city crowd. He vanished. He disappeared as suddenly as he had appeared. Goran watched him go, and his soul became calm. He understood. The truth he had been so desperately seeking was not needed for protocols and indictments. It was needed for him. Only for him. It was his personal redemption. His path to himself. He had done everything he could. He adjusted the collar of his old coat and slowly walked down the street, moving further and further away from the gray building where his entire past life remained. He was walking into the unknown, but for the first time in many years, he felt free.